All right, so usually I just give the clicker over to the person, but I'm going to try something a little bit different, and Sharon okayed this, by the way, so when I met her, I did my research, and she had authored this book. And it's called Standing Up in Saigon. And, the forward is even by Bill Gates, and I'm a big believer. I like to read whatever Bill Gates recommends. And so the significance is we also have a development office in Saigon. So I'm flying to Asia with my kids, and I'm reading this book, and I couldn't put it down, and I'm sitting in kind of the middle seat, and I'm just like crying, right? Because it was so emotional how the story was being framed. So if you get a chance, please take a look at that. And I think it also just highlights one thing that Sharon's going to talk about is the power of storytelling. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Let's appreciate David. Great intro. Thanks. So I love David's energy and enthusiasm, and thanks for that intro. And before I get started, I want to tell you a little bit more about the book. It's a true story about a Vietnamese woman. Her name is Tu Hong, and the short version is she was born a happy, healthy, normal baby, and she developed polio as a toddler. She ended up crawling on the ground for 17 years. And during those 17 years, the Vietnam War ended, Saigon fell, and her father narrowly escaped to the US. But the family was told he'd been killed in a helicopter crash. So they held his funeral, and they didn't know for 5 years that their father was living in the US. And then once they got the news that he was alive, it was another 10 years before the family was reunited. So they spent 15 years apart. And so when they were finally reunited in Texas, Tu Hong had surgery that enabled her to stand up and walk with the aid of braces and crutches after crawling on the ground. She was 20 years old when she had that surgery. So when the family came to the US, they had to learn a new culture, a new language. Tu Hong got her college degree in computer science, and she's worked at several Fortune 500 companies in the technology department. So when I had coffee with her and she shared this story with me, her story literally grabbed me and wouldn't let go. And I thought this story has to be told. It demonstrates the power of hope, the importance of determination, but most importantly, personal reinvention every time there was a new challenge that she faced. And I thought the challenges in my life pale in comparison to what she's gone through. So I'm this big believer in the power of storytelling because stories are emotion in motion. And stories have the power to transform. And I believe stories touch the heart, which then changes behavior. So today we're going to go on a journey together, so buckle up for the ride. We're going to talk about the power of storytelling. I'll talk about how to link stories in the workplace, and then I'll close with some leadership and life lessons. So first, let's start with my story. So I often say that the path to the Chief Diversity Officer job at Walmart started long before I was born. So my parents married at the tender age of 19, much to the disappointment of both sets of my grandparents, okay? They were not happy. My parents are from very different socioeconomic backgrounds and different religious backgrounds. So I don't know about your family, but whenever we would have family get-togethers, people just tell it like it is. So there were a lot of negative comments, a lot of negative stereotypes, so much so that my parents said, we're moving far away from relatives. So when I was 5 years old, they moved thousands of miles away, and they wanted to stop the stereotype, all the negative stereotypes, that cycle. And so I grew up believing you should never live near relatives, right? You should just visit them if you have to. So that's how I was raised. So because my parents were so different from each other, and they wanted to teach all of their children to value and include everybody, they got very involved in the civil rights movement and then the women's rights movement. So when I was 12, they made a very deliberate parenting decision that shaped me into the person I am today. At age 12, we moved to a neighborhood that was predominantly African American and Hispanic. And we weren't welcome in the neighborhood. We had our yard set on fire several times. Our home was vandalized. And my parents owned a small nursery and landscaping business that was vandalized as well. And I was 12. I wasn't afraid, but I wanted to make friends. I wanted to fit in. I wanted to know, who am I going to ride with on the school bus every day? And so our family lived in that neighborhood for 30 years. And what it taught me is that we're all more similar than we are different. Each one of us wants to be valued and included, respected, and loved. So it created this internal radar system that goes off in my gut when I feel people aren't being included. It made me a huge champion of diversity and inclusion. So when I think about stories and people's stories, we all have a story within us, and everybody has a fascinating story about who they are and why they are the way they are. But stories are memorable. We remember them, and they're transferable because people remember a story. And stories are the things that help us change the way we act and think and believe. And stories persuade where facts and data can't. Because oftentimes after we hear a good story, we remember the story, we might not remember the statistics or the data. So when you're thinking about work and you have concepts or ideas that you want to sell or you want buy-in, how do you create a story around that that brings numbers to light? What are the numbers saying? And how do you create a compelling story? So I want to talk about the different genres of storytelling. So the who I am is one that new leaders often use. When somebody's new to a department or new to a company, they want people to know who they are. The why I'm here one is used by politicians a lot of times. Why am I running for office, right? New leaders also talk about why am I here. And the values in action can be used for what your personal values are or what company cultural values are. A lot of times it's great for cementing the culture and sharing stories about a company culture. It's really related to the company values. And then vision, a lot of leaders paint the direction. What's the vision? Where are we headed? Where are we going? Politicians paint the vision. A lot of great storytellers paint the vision on where we want to go. And then teaching moments. What are those moments that have a lesson in them? And how do you teach those to a lot of people so that we all learn the lesson together? So I'm going to share with you a values and action story. So you heard that I'm passionate about diversity and inclusion. I have a son and a daughter, and the entire time they've been growing up, we've gone to diversity exhibits. We've watched a lot of movies about inclusion. We've invited a lot of diverse people to our home over the years. And one of my messages to my children has consistently been, if you see something inappropriate, speak up and speak out. Okay, so I'm at a public swimming pool in Arkansas with my daughter. She's 12 years old. It's Memorial Day weekend. We walk in, the pool's crowded. It's a holiday weekend. There's a lot of kids in the pool, and there's 4 African-American children in the pool. The next thing that I do is not good parenting advice. I decide I'm going to lay down and fall asleep on a chaise lounge, okay? It's been a heavy week at work. My daughter's 12. She's a good swimmer. There's a lifeguard. I'm not encouraging that, but that's what I did, okay? So I laid down. I'm dozing on and off, and all of a sudden I hear, "Why don't you morons get out of the pool?" And so for a moment, I'm thinking, did I dream that? I dozed off. And so I slowly sat up and I looked and I don't see the African-American children anywhere, not in the pool, not anywhere around. So I motioned my daughter to come over. I said, "What happened?" And she described that the man that oversees the pool had hollered that. And so here I am. I've told my daughter for 12 years, speak up or speak out. And what am I going to do as a parent? And what am I going to do as a person who's championing diversity and inclusion? And I thought, do I say something publicly? We all learn the lesson together. I didn't know any other person at that pool, but do I take a stand publicly or do I do it privately? So I decided that I would talk to the man on the Tuesday after the holiday weekend, right? I decided I would do it privately. So that Tuesday after Memorial Day weekend, I didn't tell my coworkers where I was going, didn't tell my husband, but I drove to that pool. And so there's this little cement bunker of a building next to the pool, and I walk in, and the man is sitting behind the desk, and it's just he and I. So I say to the man, I introduce myself, I'm Sharon Orlopp, I just want to talk about something that happened on Saturday. So I said to him, "Did you say, 'Why don't all you morons get out of the pool?'" He jumps up from his chair, he says, "Are you calling me a racist?" My first thought is, nobody knows I'm here in case something happens. I also knew I was deep in the conversation, but I paused before I responded. And what I said to him is, "I'm not calling you a racist, but I'm concerned about how you made the children feel and how you made everybody in the entire area feel with your comments." So he proceeded to tell me that he calls Hispanics morons. He calls women morons. He calls Asians morons. So he's what I call an equal employment opportunity offender, right? And so he and I spent the next 15 to 20 minutes not arriving at any common ground, right? And so I left. 2 weeks later, my daughter and I go back to the swimming pool, and I come walking in. He says, you, I know what you do for a living. And I'm not sure how he figured that out, but there are ways. And he said, "I want to thank you." He says, "I'm not going to call anybody a moron again." I was like, wow. And then 4 years later was the next time we went to the swimming pool. So my daughter was 16. We walk in another holiday weekend. It happened to be Labor Day. And my daughter and I walk in, and he says, you, I remember you. And I said, we will always be connected because of that conversation. So the moral of that story is speak up and speak out. It takes a lot of courage. It can be terrifying. It can be scary, but it's the right thing to do. And the other tip I'll give, I heard this from a woman named Leslie Aguilar. if you don't know what to say, and most of the times we're caught flat-footed, when somebody says something stupid or inappropriate, we're not sure what to say, and like 10 minutes later, we think the perfect thing to say. So when you don't know what to say, just say, ouch. When you say ouch, it gets real quiet, okay? Everybody knows what ouch means. And you don't even have to say anything after ouch. But if you want to say something after you've said ouch and now there's a lot of silence, you can say something like, we don't talk like that here, right? Or we're inclusive of everybody here. Or that's not what we're all about, right? But just say ouch when you don't know what to say. And that moment when there's silence, your brain will tell you what the next thing is that you can say. But people understand that. So let's talk about how you create a powerful story. So think about Greeks. The Greeks came up with 3 acts, right? Their plays were always 3 acts. And it's easy to remember, the beginning, the middle, and the end. That's not too tough, okay? So the beginning, you lay out the story. The middle part is where the key event happens, and also the resolution happens in the middle. And then the end should be quick and short, right? After you've told your story, don't spend a lot of time on the end. Wrap it up real quickly. But if you think of 3 parts of a story, that's the story arc. It helps you put your story into phases. And you know how to build up to the key part, talk about what got resolved, and then quickly end it. So that's the format of a powerful story. So I'm going to share a couple of stories about how I linked personal stuff at home into work stories. And so some of these stories are around inclusion, some around HR best practices, and some are around engagement. So this one I call Dining at the Religious Smorgasbord. Those are my children in that photo. They were ages 8 and 12. So I mentioned my parents have different religious backgrounds. My mom grew up in the Church of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as Mormons, and she was the first person in her family to marry outside her faith. My father grew up as a Methodist. Later, my parents divorced. My mom married a man who's Jewish. My brother's wife is Jewish. So I say, at all of our holidays, we are always dining at the religious smorgasbord. We have a lot of different faiths in our family. So we had planned a vacation one summer, and part of it was going to be spending about a day and a half at my aunt and uncle's. We're going to be meeting all my cousins, and this is on the Mormon side of the family. So one of the things I talked to our children about is my Mormon relatives don't drink anything with caffeine. So there won't be any coffee, tea, Coke, things like that. I told my children, we will drink what's provided, right? We're guests in their home. We will drink and eat what's provided. Don't ask for anything that's not out. And they said, what about Dad? Dad loves his morning coffee, like he can't do without his coffee. I said, Dad will choose to drink whatever is put out. He'll be just fine. So we had this great vacation week. We go to my aunt and uncle's, and in that morning, the next morning when we got up, on the kitchen countertop was a coffee maker and a small can of coffee. So we had breakfast, we jumped in the car, we're gonna go to the airport, we're flying back home, and I say to my kids, what was your most memorable event of the vacation? So let me tell you what we'd done before we went to my aunt and uncle's. We spent 4 days on a covered wagon trip in the Grand Tetons, sleeping under the stars at night. We spent 2 days at Yellowstone with the magnificent geysers. We did zip lining in Utah. So I say, what was the most memorable event of this past week? And both of them said, seeing that coffee maker and that can of coffee. They said it showed that they care about us and they wanted us to feel welcome. And I was like, wow, that is powerful. I'm going to use that in some stories at work about being an inclusive leader, right? My kids have said, stop talking about us in all of your speeches. But anyway, so we talk about what are the symbols of inclusion at work. And usually it's an interactive exercise. But people in the audience will say, the books that you read or the books that are in your desk space indicate what interests you and whether or not you're an inclusive leader. The artifacts around your desk area, so where you might have traveled, anything that you have from different organizations, the people you eat lunch with on a regular basis demonstrate whether you're inclusive. The people that you have on your team, the people you go on business trips with. And so there's different symbols that indicate to others whether or not you're an inclusive leader. And we talk about what are your symbols of inclusion at home? Do you invite a lot of diverse people into your life and have them come to your house? What do your artifacts at home say about you? What do your books say about you? What type of trips do you take? So then I usually wrap it up with inclusive behaviors. So the symbols of inclusion that we talked about, inviting people into your life who are different than you. And then this one is really critical, asking quiet employees for their opinion. Because we're all in meetings, there's a lot of people that like to use up the airspace, right? And then there's the people that really have the great ideas that sometimes don't share them. And so noticing that and saying, Joe, what do you think about that, right? And pulling out those ideas, because quieter people process a lot. They're the deeper thinkers. You just have to ask them for it. And so listen generously and with intent. I always say taking notes is a sign of respect, like when people are talking, take it electronically or in writing, whichever way you prefer. And then the last one is I always publicly praise people who push back, who ask those great questions, or who say that idea might not make sense. I don't want to be surrounded with yes people. And so in meetings, if you publicly appreciate those people who push back or ask those key questions or change the direction of the conversation or decisions, other people will know, wow, that person's comfortable with pushback. That's what we should do. So that's how I think you demonstrate inclusion and that you want different ideas. So I'm going to switch gears for a minute to a teaching story. And this is about my son, Oren. So Oren was born 9 weeks premature. He spent his first few months in the hospital, and he's a fighter, he's a survivor. But he's always been in the 10th percentile in height. And when he was in grade school, he'd always say, Mom, when can I stop standing in the front row for school pictures? I just want to stand on the bleachers one time, right? But he loves baseball. He's played baseball since he's been very, very young. And so in high school, he said to his baseball coach, Coach, what do I need to do to improve? How can I be a better baseball player? I want to play baseball in college. What do I need to do differently? And his coach said, son, let me tell you what you're doing well. He said, you're our best defensive player. You'll do whatever it takes to make a play. He said, and mentally, you understand the strategy of baseball. You know a lot about the game. And my son said, thank you very much, but tell me what I need to do better. I want to play ball in college. What do I need to do differently? And the coach said, Oren, you need to be taller. Okay, so as a parent and as an HR professional, feedback on stuff that's not actionable can be dangerous. So I got home from work that day, and my son was on the internet looking up steroids, growth hormones, stretching exercises. And so I use this story every year during performance evaluation time. As leaders, it's important that we give people both positive feedback and constructive feedback, and both should be specific. But the constructive feedback has to be something they can do. It's harmful to tell somebody to do something that they have no way of doing at all. And so the next story is also about performance management. It's about my washer and dryer. Okay, so I look for stories in everything, okay? So we had a washer that broke down. We had a dryer that broke down. And you don't get to test drive dryers or washers, right? You read the reviews, you try to figure out what you want to go get, you look at them. So we bought a new dryer. We bring it home, you get it installed, get the old one out. And the first load of laundry I did was towels. When I put it in the dryer, at the end of the cycle, they weren't quite dry. But I rationalized it away, right? I said, oh, it's heavy, it's a load of towels, that's understandable. So the second load was a load of clothing, and the dryer didn't dry it all the way, so it needed extra time or another cycle. So I had this poor performing dryer, and it's like, do I get rid of it? Do I go through the hassle of trying to refund the dryer, pick out another one? But I say, no, I'll deal with it, I'll keep it. But then what I found is my high performing washing machine started to suffer. Right, so it had the wet clothes still in it while I was waiting for the dryer to go through 2 cycles, right? So it used to be they ran about the same amount of time, I could do laundry more efficiently, but now all of a sudden my high-performing dryer is becoming a low performer because it's sitting idle and it can't do its job because it's waiting on the dryer. So I share this at work about the difference between poor performers and top performers. And a lot of times we give poor performers a lot of chances, we rationalize away subpar behavior, we spend a lot of time with them, but I don't know that we always think about the effect on top performers. Right? And top performers get fed up if we tolerate poor performance, right? And their performance starts to slip. So whenever I've shared this story, occasionally I have employees that say, quit comparing us to washers and dryers, okay? But I do look for a lesson in most things that happen. So this one is about Sam's Club. I was the head of HR at Sam's Club for about 8 years. And this was back in November and December of 2009. So Sam's Club is part of the Walmart family, and so Sam's Club is the small business. It's $60 billion, but it's only 12% of all of Walmart's revenue, right? The next business is the international business, and then the large gorilla-sized business is the Walmart business. So from a career trajectory, sometimes people would start at Sam's Club, move to international, and then move to Walmart. So in November and December of 2009, our CEO, Doug McMillan, was the CEO of Sam's Club. He was promoted to CEO of International, and even though it was our busiest retail season, they needed him more in International than at Sam's Club. So we were happy to see him promoted, but sad to see him leave. He's an incredible leader. Now he oversees all of Walmart, great culture champion, so it was bittersweet. At that same time period, during our Super Bowl of retail, right, which is the holiday season, we also lost our EVP of merchandising and our EVP of operations. So our top 3 roles are empty and they're empty for about 4 months. And so the people that are running the business are HR, finance, and legal, and that's just scary in and of itself, you know, even though I'm in HR, right? So you've got all the support teams, as you would say, running the business. So there was a lot of chatter in the hallway. Morale was really down. People felt that, what's wrong with our Walmart company? Do they think the Sam's business is unimportant because they haven't named leaders? There was all this chatter and speculation about why have we gone so long without naming leaders. So every March is Associate Appreciation Month, and that's because bonuses are paid in March. So typically what we would do is each manager would write a handwritten note to every member of their team, put it on their desk for that morning, and we had a payday candy bar, you know, payday because they're getting their bonus, right? So that was typically what we did. So this is March of 2010. I said to my team, we need to do something different. Morale is really low, and we still haven't named who our leaders are. What can we do? What are some ideas? So one person on my team said, what about renting golf carts? And when people park their cars in our parking lot, which was far away, we'll drive them on the golf cart. And March in Arkansas can be kind of ugly, right? And cold out weather-wise. So that was very inexpensive. Another person on my team said, what about giving them free coffee that day or a free beverage? Anything that they drink at the cafeteria would be free that day. So that's the cafeteria, perfect. So that's what we did. So that morning, and it was bitterly cold. So my team members are driving the rented golf carts. They have on mittens, hats, and scarves. Their coffee's going cold the minute they go outside, but they're out there picking up people from their cars, and they bring them to the front entrance of our headquarters. And people would get out, and we had a group that was greeting them by name in the lobby, telling them about free coffee, free beverages, and people's shoulders straightened up. They had a pep in their step, and I tell people that the building actually levitated that day, right? It was like this huge burst of energy that we had. And the lesson I learned is we can't keep doing the same thing around recognition and motivation. And there's a lot of things to do that are inexpensive but creative. And so thinking about how do you change it up and how do you personalize it? But that was like a really turning point for us. And then later we got some leaders named, not due to the Associate Appreciation Day, but that I think was important. So I'm going to close with my last story, and this is about life and leadership lessons at the MS 150. So the MS 150 is a bicycle event for 150 miles over a weekend, and it supports multiple sclerosis. And so I've done it 4 times, but I'm going to talk about the first 2 that I did, and both of them were in Dallas. So the first time that I did it, I only made it 65 miles. I didn't make it through the full event. And the second time, I made the full 150 miles. Both of those events, I trained about the same amount, which is not enough, right? Life interferes, you have these great training plans, and it doesn't happen. And a lot of it is mental. So I'll talk about some of the differences I learned. So the first one is knowing why the finish line motivates your associates. So at this MS 150, I would meet people that were there for a lot of different reasons. Some people had family members and loved ones who have MS. Others were there because they were elite cyclists, and they wanted to break their personal best record. Some people were there as a social event, just a great way to be with friends and to exercise. And so when you translate it to the workplace, how do we know what motivates all of our employees? They're there for different reasons, and so knowing those reasons and helping them achieve their aspirations or goals based on what motivates them is important. The next one, this was the biggest lesson I learned, is changing milestones changes perspectives. So the first event, same exact route both years, the first event, I was doing fine in the morning. I went to lunch. At lunch, they recommend carbing up. There's a lot of different theories on what you should eat when you're doing these races, but at the time, it was carb up. So there was pasta, pizza, potatoes. There was a lot of great stuff at lunch, right? So I powered away because I figured I need a lot of energy. Well, what happens after lunch, right? We all know what happens. So I get on my bike, and I'm a little sluggish. And after lunch, there's 10 hills, and these are steep hills, right? Really steep hills. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is really tough. And at these events, they have these big white vans, and they're called sag wagons. I'm not sure why they're called sag wagons, but that's what they're called. And so these sag wagons are filled with very cheerful volunteers. You're riding your bike, you're trying to stay concentrated, and they pull up beside you, say, hey, would you like a ride? I can throw your bike in the back, I can take you to the finish line, I can take you to the next pit stop. Are you sure you don't want to ride? So I'm going up and down these hills, and these sag wagons keep coming by, and pretty soon my legs start talking to my brain. And my legs are saying, hey, we're not going any further. And my brain's like, no, we can keep on going. And my legs are like, no, we're stopping. So anyway, I stopped, got off my bike, got in a sag wagon, and that was it, right? I did 65 miles. So the next year, same thing, lack of training, good intentions, lack of training, but I'm determined I'm going to make the 150 miles. So this time, same route, they moved the location of lunch. So they put lunch after the 5th hill, right? So the year before is before any of the 10 hills. This time it's at hill 5. So they had these little signs that said lunch further ahead. Never any mileage, just further ahead, and I kept trying to figure out what further ahead meant. But it was lunch, so I kept pedaling, right? So I made it through the 5 hills, get to lunch, and I'm like, I am gonna make it this time, right? So I get on my bike right after lunch, and the heavens open up. I mean, just pouring down rain. I'm drenched, but I'm gonna keep pedaling. But half of the 3,500 bike riders that day got in sag wagons, right? I'm like, no, I'm gonna keep going, even though I'm soaking wet. And so what this taught me was just changing that location of lunch really changed my perspective, because what happened, I made it over the other 5 hills after lunch, then it flattened out for the entire rest of the day, and it was gorgeous scenery. So just changing milestones in key work projects, especially projects that seem really, really difficult, is how do you change that milestone? How do you make it seem more achievable so that people's mindset changes? And had I known that it flattened out after those 10 hills and it was really easy, I would have fought harder the first time. So I think changing milestones is critical. The next one is I talk about these signs, right? So there are all kinds of signs encouraging riders. That one that says lunch further ahead, they had a lot of those. But my favorite said pit stop 1 mile ahead, right? I can make it 1 mile. There were pit stops every 10 miles. But when I saw these signs, I thought we need to do more of that in the workplace. How do we encourage people more? How do we give them those words of praise and commitment and support? Because those really kept me going. And then this one is utilize others for ideas. So I was at a pit stop, and I heard this woman say, you know what I do at every pit stop? I drink pickle juice. And I've never had pickle juice, but they had a place where you could get pickle juice. So I thought, well, she tried it, I'll try it. It is pretty tart and salty and vinegary, but it restores your electrolytes right away, right? And then at that same pit stop, I heard a man talking about BioFreeze, right? And I had never heard of BioFreeze. It's like Bengay. So I went over to the BioFreeze table. They made you put on these rubber gloves, and you rub it into your legs. So I got on my bike, right? I had the pickle juice, I had the BioFreeze, and I flew, right? Like I didn't feel anything in my legs. They were numb, right? I didn't feel any pain. I was like, wow. And so every pit stop, I actually drank 2 glasses of pickle juice at every pit stop, lathered up in BioFreeze, and off I go, right? And so when I think about the workplace, it's like everybody has these great ideas and suggestions. Or yesterday at the session I sat in on change, lots of great ideas around the table. So capturing those ideas and acting on them, I think, is important. So here's the last piece of this story. I've ridden 140 miles. I have 10 miles left to go. I'm going to hit my goal of 150, right? So at the last pit stop, drink my 2 glasses of pickle juice, lather up with BioFreeze, and I am ready to go. And a man drives in on a motorcycle to the pit stop. He's an MS volunteer. He said, there's tornado activity in the area. He says, and if the weather gets really bad, we're putting all the cyclists in a sag wagon. I thought, I pity the person who's going to try and get me in a sag wagon when I have 10 miles left to go. It's like, that is going to be a sorry sight for that person. So anyway, so I've got my BioFreeze and my pickle juice. I get on my bike, and I am pedaling like crazy, but the winds are 30 miles an hour. And I felt like I was riding in a wind tunnel. I mean, I'm doing lots of revolutions on my pedals, and I'm going like inches. And then the rain came, right? So it's really windy, it's rainy. And I keep seeing these sag wagons drive past me, right? I'm on my handlebars. I'm like, I am not getting in a sag wagon. I'd say that every time one would go past. And there were about 3 of us riding near the end in this little group. And all of us would say that whenever a sag wagon went by, right? So we're pedaling and we're pedaling. I'm like, I'm going to make it 150 miles. And I see a whole series of sag wagons go by, right? Like 3 or 4 of them. Then they go over to the curb, right? I'm like, I'm just going to pretend they're not there. I'm going to keep pedaling. I'm pedaling really slow. I see the drivers get out of sag wagons. I'm like, oh no, this is not going to be good, right? And they get out and they start clapping, and they encourage all of us to finish. And it was so powerful. And so that leads me to the next piece, which is there's this huge difference between good and great. So when I did 65 miles, we had a lot of Sam's Club employees there, a lot of Walmart employees. We encouraged and appreciated everybody. You could do 1 mile, 5 miles, 10 miles. Whatever your distance was, we appreciated people who participated. But the difference in the way I felt after 65 miles versus 150 miles, I felt like I'd climbed Mount Everest, right? And when we create these big, hairy, audacious goals for ourselves, and then you push into all the barriers and the obstacles, but you survive and you make it, it makes you realize that we all have this unleashed potential inside of us, and we should constantly set big, hairy, audacious goals because we can do it. It just takes a lot of reminding yourself mentally that you can do it and setting those goals. So to sum up about being a powerful storyteller is I want each of you to think about the 10 or more stories in your life. We all have stories from personal experiences, professional experiences, but what are those top 10 stories in your life? And then look for common themes. What are the common themes in those stories that really mean a lot to you? And then how do you turn them into that Greek play with the 3 acts? How do you create a beginning, middle, and an end? And how do you do it succinctly and memorably? So try to make it where it's 2 minutes, and then ask for feedback. Share it with family members, friends, people at work, and keep refining it and keep whittling it so you get rid of the stuff that really doesn't need to be in there, and that'll make you a powerful storyteller. And people will remember those stories more than they'll remember the facts or figures, but those stories capture the heart, and that's how you change behavior. So in closing, my favorite quote is, "Stories are the currency of human contact." Thank you for your time. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sharon. So for the folks in the audience, I'm taking questions, and you can vote up other people's questions on sli.do. So the first question, Sharon, is, it seems like people who speak up or speak out are thought of as not team players, especially if they don't end up being right that one time. How do you handle or balance that?
So I think everybody should demonstrate managerial courage, or it takes a lot of courage to have a different opinion than the rest, and you're going to win some stuff and not win some stuff, right? And I think you have to determine which are the ones that you really, really want to win or that you feel very passionate about. But I think being a person who's known for maybe having the only point of view in the room that's different than others, but being comfortable that you bring that different point of view, I think gives you the courage to do it, because you might be right. It might be a while before people recognize that you're right, but it doesn't mean that you stop doing it.
Great. And so this one's rocketing up. You have some very overt examples of racism. How do you identify and handle when racism is less obvious because it's more subtle in the workplace?
Yeah. So I think there are very few examples of overt racism. Yeah, some of the stories I had, but most of it's subtle, right? And it's a feeling that you might get or a sense that you might get, but even calling that out, right? So if you notice that a certain group, so whether it's women or race or religion or whatever it is, isn't being included in discussions or might not be invited to lunch or to business meetings or business trips, saying something about it, right? To the person's manager or to your boss or whatever, saying, hey, I think we need to have more Asians on this trip when we're looking at things for customers, or I think we're missing a woman's point of view on this, right? There's ways to just say it generically, because I do think it is more subtle, but I think paying attention to it and then just saying, I always use the word I, right? Say, I think this feels unusual, or I think we need to do something different, you know, just owning what your perceptions or observations are. Or a lot of times just an observation, hey, it seems like we don't have many Hispanics on the team, and we have a lot of customers that are Spanish speaking. Do we need to do something different?
Yeah. And I think I love that ouch phrase, because I remember one time I was in Texas, and I'm from Texas, when someone says something racist, and I kind of just froze like a deer in a headlight, and now I feel like I'm much better equipped to deal with something with some simple, powerful words there. The other thing is, when do you decide to talk to someone in private versus in public? And I think this may be alluding to the story you told about the gentleman who was managing the pool.
Yeah. So I wrestle with this, and there's no right or wrong answers, right? First off, there's no statute of limitations on when you can talk to people about stupid behavior, right? So a lot of times we let it go and we think, oh, I never need to address that. But you say, hey, you know, a year ago you said this at a meeting and it made me feel uncomfortable, right? So it's best not to let time go by, but even if time has gone by, you can bring it up later. But I evaluate the situation. I'm a big person about let's have the whole lesson, right? So I'll give you an example. I also do HR for Orange Theory Fitness, and sometimes in our lobbies before each class, there's about 30 people in the lobby area. We have members sometimes that say something stupid, right? And so our employees freeze. And so if they don't say anything, does it mean that Orange Theory Fitness supports those kind of comments that a member just made? Right? And so I've talked to them about saying ouch, and that if you need to say something, because otherwise they think, wow, is Orange Theory Fitness condoning this behavior? Right? And so there are moments when it's important to do it publicly, and it can be thoughtful. You don't have to call anybody out. You can just say, ouch, We don't talk like that here, right? And then 30 people got that lesson, right? Or we can choose to meet with the person privately, which is what we do sometimes too, but those other 29 people don't know we met with that person privately, right? And so I think you have to evaluate it. Some of it's a comfort level, and some of it is when you want everybody to get the lesson, then you do it as a public group. And you can do it thoughtfully and tactfully where everybody gets the message and you're not harming the person who might have said something inappropriate, but everybody understands that that's not the way we talk here. And so I think there are trade-offs and there are pros and cons. I think if it's super serious behavior, it's definitely a private conversation and people need to know what the expectations are in the workplace.
Yeah, so it sounds like in that example at Orange Theory Fitness, because they may be working at the front desk and there's a customer saying something like that's why that training is so important to know when to say ouch in public or talking to the person individually afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely.
Got it. So the next one is, what do you do when morale initiatives wear off? It sounded like you had that awesome one with the golf carts and the free drinks, but it seems like, some of those have a shelf life. So how do you keep those fresh and invigorated?
So I think the most important thing, and part of what TINYpulse helps you do, is get ideas from everybody else, right? Everybody in the whole organization. Hey, we really want to change up our associate appreciation. What ideas do you have? Or what's important to you? What would you like to see? And I think that's how you keep it fresh. Plus, it shows that you value them, you like their feedback, and you act on it.
Yeah. Well, so I think everyone loved that idea of the free, inexpensive motivation tactics. Do you have others that you've experienced along the way that you can share as well?
So I think what matters the most is usually just personal recognition from your boss, right? So whether it is the handwritten card or mostly a conversation, or if a boss calls somebody out in a meeting and appreciates who they are and what they did, I think that personal touch, as long as it's specific, right? If you just say, Monica, you did a great job, right? And everybody in the meeting's going, what was that? Like, did she show up for work on time? Or did she finish a great project that really made a difference to the company? So I think being specific, but I think if you can do it privately, but more importantly, if there are opportunities to do it in a meeting or a large group, I think that has huge impact.
So I'm going to change it up a little bit. Okay. So people want to know, how did you meet Tu-Heng?
Oh, okay. So Tu-Heng and I actually both worked at Walmart but never knew each other, okay? So I retired from Walmart, I moved to Arizona, and I had a mentee who was from China. He sent me a text. I'm living in Arizona. He said, hey, if you're ever back in Arkansas, you need to meet this woman named Tu-Heng. She's got a great story. That was the text, right? So I was back in Northwest Arkansas one November. I set up a coffee meeting with her, and that's when she shared the story. And at the end, I said, you need to write a book about this. She said, I'm looking for the right person to write it with me. I said, pick me, I'll do it. And then she and I started every Sunday after that, we spoke by FaceTime, right? And we put together a project plan on who would, when we would get certain chapters written. And every Sunday for a year, we talked and put together. And I traveled to Arkansas. I spent a couple weeks with her and her dad to get the story. But it was a lot of fun, but it was just by circumstances, by relationships. My mentee suggested it, and that's how we met.
You still stay in touch today?
Oh, we do. Actually, we talk one Sunday a month, and we still travel and do speaking events together. And she's phenomenal. She's incredible. So.
Wow, that's great. So how do you champion managers who may not personally be driven by recognition or appreciation to authentically participate in this for members of their team? It sounds like it's around, like, how do you motivate those people who may not be as driven by recognition or appreciation?
Yeah. So it's kind of back to know why the finish line impacts your associates. If you know why people are motivated, so some people in the workplace, they're there, most of us are there also just for a livelihood, right? Put food on the table, pay bills. Some people are there because it's a path in career progression. Some people want to try something outside their wheelhouse, a new challenge, a new skill. So knowing why people are there and what motivates them, right? Some people aren't big on motivation and recognition. So what are they big on, right? Do they want extra time off to spend time with family? Do they want additional training or conference attendance? What are the different things? And I think knowing those, and sometimes in HR, people think fair means consistent. Right? To me, fair means also knowing what each person needs or wants, right? And being consistent within that. Not everybody needs the same thing, so figuring out what people need and how can you do that as a leader or manager of people.
And I think this one has been in a lot of HR people blogosphere is, what is your take on unconscious bias and how leaders can raise their own awareness.
Yeah. So actually, unconscious bias, there's a program by Microsoft. It's free for all companies. And we use it at Orange Theory Fitness and Core Scientific. So if you ever go online and just key in unconscious bias, over 70,000 people have taken it around the world. It's in a lot of different languages. And it was created by Gwen Houston, their chief diversity officer, after Satya made a tough comment around women, right? And Microsoft got a lot of pushback on that. And so it's an incredible, incredible program. And so it talks about the subtleties, and it gives a lot of very real examples about what happens in meetings, what happens around promotions, and just dialogue like that. So I encourage you, if you're not familiar with it, to take a look at it. And I think it helps people understand how do you look for those subtleties and what do you do differently, because unconscious bias, I'm very clear with leaders that I've worked for about what I want out of the job, and I'm very clear about, like early in my career, a lot of times there was assumptions that women wouldn't travel once you got married or once you had kids, or women wouldn't relocate, right? You always worry about what assumptions people have. So I'm going to be real clear on what I want out of life, right? Or what I'm willing to do. And so over my lifetime, I've always been like, I will travel, I will relocate, I will do this, I will do that. Don't make an assumption because of my personal life that I'm limited from certain promotions or areas of opportunity. And so I think always being real clear with what you will and won't do or what you do and don't want. And then your boss isn't making some assumptions that may or may not be there. You don't know what assumptions they might be making. So I think always being very transparent and honest helps out a lot.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So a couple more questions is, what can leaders do to make people feel included even though they may decide we aren't going to do it that way?
Mm-hmm. So I think always soliciting opinions and input and feedback, and then being clear. So I think people want to feel heard and valued, and they're okay if you say, great idea, but we're not going to do it because of X, Y, Z, right? But at least they know the person listened, they heard me, but there's reasons why we're not going to do it. So I think explaining what those reasons are, but still thanking people for bringing those ideas.
Mm-hmm. And then what about, I think this is interesting, is anything unique you have found that works to increase diversity in hiring for traditionally challenging positions like the technology field?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about what we did at Walmart, and we linked diversity to performance. And so a couple things. We made sure that as we're recruiting talent, there had to be a diverse slate. You couldn't have a single candidate slate, right? So you just can't have one person applying for the role. And we wanted to make sure that the slate was diverse, both from a race and gender perspective. And so if a manager said, hey, I want to hire so-and-so, we looked, let's see who your slate of candidates were, right? And were there a lot of candidates and were there diverse candidates? We talked with all the recruiting firms that we used too, that it was a requirement that we had a diverse slate and a lot of candidates. We just didn't want single slates, so that was important. And then we reported diversity metrics to the board every 3 months. We report them to senior leaders. We had a lot of events. So with our population, all store managers and assistant managers and everybody in the home office, you had to attend 2 diversity events per year, and those were tracked. And you had to mentor people who didn't look like you, right? And that was tracked. And so if people did not attend those events, those 2 events, and if they did not mentor people who were different than themselves, there was a ding to their bonus. So it's amazing what happens when it's linked to compensation, right? All of a sudden you will go to those diversity events, right? And you will look for mentoring other people. So I think you have to put your money where your mouth is around diversity metrics. And I think you have to report them regularly. And we always emphasized hire the best candidate. We want a diverse candidate slate. We want the best talent hired, because sometimes people have this perception, well, if you have a diverse candidate slate, do we lower our expectations? We have to hire the diverse person. We want the best candidate, but you will find the best candidate by having a diverse slate and having a lot of candidates for the job.
Amazing feedback, ladies and gentlemen. Sharon Orlopp.
Oh, thank you.